Good morning, everyone. Good morning.
How do you do? Super, thanks.
Can everyone please find a seat? We're trying to move away from Peacebuilding standard time into precision time this morning. Good morning, everyone. If you could please take your seats. I admire everyone's energy on day 3. Yay. Good. Welcome, everyone, to the 3rd day of the Alliance for Peacebuilding annual conference. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you. So Alyssa Wilson would have been so proud yesterday. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, we dedicated day 2 of the conference to Alyssa Wilson's memory. She would have been happy to see such energy, creativity, and a real willingness to dig in and engage in new ideas. We had close to 80 people here yesterday for our systems mapping workshop. We had people exploring new ideas about narrative. And I've never experienced a community so willing to wrestle with new frameworks and ideas and to think hard about how we apply those to peacebuilding around the world and also here at home. And we hear you loud and clear about focusing at home. Although we have always framed our work internationally, it's clear that we have serious peacebuilding issues here in the United States, and invite all of you from outside the US to work with us in bridging our own divides here in the US. So in the day ahead, we will start with our inaugural Future of Peace lecture, which I'll talk about more in a moment. We have a plenary on innovative financing and partnerships for peace. We'll have a round of panels, and then workshops this afternoon, giving you the chance to have hands-on experience ranging from neuroscience and rewiring the brain for peace, to the intersection of peacebuilding and social movements, to how to work with today's madmen. I have a few announcements, which I seem to have left on my seat. So, oh no, here they are, sorry. So just before I move on to the future of peace, a reminder to all of you to please fill out the conference survey. We want all of your thoughts. And if this isn't one of the questions already, let us know whether you prefer the October or May date for the conference. I know especially those of you from academia, that's a very serious decision. To remind those of you who will be attending the Young Peacebuilders Forum, what time does that start? 10:45, to please encourage you. We have really wonderful speakers and mentors for those of you who are just entering the peacebuilding field, a chance to really get some advice about how to begin your careers. Please return your name tags when you leave. We're trying to be sustainable, and we'll recycle those. A reminder from the Peace and Collaborative Development Network, there are free books outside, so please feel free to take those. And then for the speakers who are speaking on the 11:15 program, please come about 10 minutes before to get mic'd so that we're all ready to go at 11:15. So now I'm very happy to move into the first Future of Peace inaugural lecture. It's a great pleasure to announce this. It's a lecture series underwritten by AFP's amazing board chair, Robert Berg, who has dedicated his career to the impact of peacebuilding. He established the first Office of Learning and Evaluation at USAID and held multiple positions at the United Nations to build the impact of peace and development. Bob has a deep intellectual curiosity, a passion for applying ideas into practice, an encyclopedic knowledge of all conflict contexts around the world, and on top of it, a true gift for friendship and unwavering dedication to the Alliance for Peacebuilding and all that we stand for. And this lecture series is a true gift for our field, an opportunity to stand at a 30,000-foot view to see what's coming next on the horizon and to inspire us beyond the everyday. Bob will introduce our speaker, Dr. Eric Rasmussen, who himself embodies in his work the humanitarian ideals behind all that we do in peacebuilding, and whose ability to cross intellectual as well as physical borders will become clear in his lecture today. Eric has had a grueling travel schedule. He wrote to me from a plane with one screen dealing with Puerto Rico and one screen dealing with the logistics of coming here today. The energies of any humanitarian relief expert are stretched to the breaking point these days. So we're doubly grateful to you, Eric, for being here today. And I feel this lecture is a wonderful full circle back to what we heard from Assistant Secretary General Oscar Taranco of how we can link humanitarian assistance and development in the pursuit of peace and conflict prevention. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, Eric. And Bob, I'll let you introduce our speaker.
So it's convenient for you to get.
Thank you, Melanie. A little over the top, but very much appreciated. Thanks. And I needed it because I read the morning paper and I was feeling down. We pulled out of UNESCO, and I was a senior advisor to UNESCO. The president has threatened to pull out of Puerto Rico, and I just lost a house very close to Puerto Rico. And he's aiming to pull out health care from the poorest, and I have relatives who really could be badly impacted from this. So, of course, this is a non-political forum, of course, here, but we do need the help of psychiatrists to understand our times. So, well, I've had the experience of two intellectual roundtables, and I love them. The first, I went to the University of Chicago for graduate work because I thought that at that time we had many countries that had just achieved independence, and they had a New Nations Committee, and I wanted to see that around. And the greats of that university sat around, literally a round table. Michael Davies, the founder of Blue Cross, Ed Levy, the dean of the law school, later became president of the university, Ted Schultz, who then got a Nobel in economics, the famous anthropologist Cliff Geertz, the spiritual heir of Max Weber, Ed Schills, and on and on. And they would throw a problem out in the middle of the table, and they would look at it from various disciplines. I thought that was the hottest thing ever. And later on in government, when I was asked to start the evaluation work of USAID, I kind of used that pattern and got two fabulous anthropologists who had gotten their PhDs under Margaret Mead, and a leading historian who happened, he's somebody we talk to now quite a bit. He's the world's expert on Burma and now Myanmar and North Korea, quite a combo. And great political scientists, macro and micro economists and so forth. And without intending to be it, we became the intellectual center at USAID during those years. So I believe in this. And I thought, well, we need in this peace-building field an intellectual table of many disciplines, looking at our problems, bringing us new insights. But maybe we could do it in series and then, kind of put it together mentally, maybe getting this lecture series and putting it together in a book, but also maybe one of these is even bringing people together from this series and having them with us. And I had the feeling that maybe the right size table would hold about 20, but as it turned out, we only had the resources for half of that. So we have Eric Rasmussen, who has at least 10 fields of expertise to fill out the table. Actually, wholesale is better than retail. So, and he is, to list those 10, a doctor, a pioneer of humanitarian medicine, an international consultant, a former Navy officer, a scientist, an explorer, a founding CEO, a professor, a communications informatics expert, and a synthetic thinker on peace. So his half of the table is now covered, as you will see, and it is an enormous joy to invite Erik Rasmussen to address us on this inaugural lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I want to give credit to the images that you're going to see behind me. I travel with a photographer on my team named Lorenzo Moscia out of Rome. Lorenzo is under contract to National Geographic, The Economist, Der Spiegel. He works out of Chile. He lives in Rome. And he travels around the world with me. What he has offered as a gift to you is no matter what I spout here, you're going to have some very interesting images of humanity in the roles that he has seen in war, in peace, and elsewhere that will, I think, enlighten you no matter what happens here at the podium. Lorenzo Moscia. Thank you for welcoming me today and for giving me the opportunity to offer your inaugural viewpoint on the future of peace. It's an honor to be selected, and based on the breakfast this morning, it's somewhat intimidating. As you've perhaps read, my perspective is one that's informed by the practical aspects and the significant costs of failing at peace. My task, though, today is to give you reasons to practice one of my favorite exhortations from Raymond Williams, to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. I've spent some time over the past month thinking carefully about your perspective on this moment here today, and I recognize that you've spent a lot of time listening to each other over the past 2 days. I'm also aware that you're a very sophisticated audience, and several of you have been leading lights for decades in the philosophy of peace, in diplomacy, and in the complex task of social calming. As a result, you're aware that no global or regional or local or personal peace is possible without justice, without equity, without a sense of perspective that includes both fairness on an individual human scale and a sense of societal integration, of shared responsibility, of being a willing part of a larger whole that contains a common vision. You have a nice website that's detailed and clear on all of that. You also know that we are all trying in this process to shape minds and hearts toward peace in places that are not really acceptable for human habitation, where peace seems as unlikely as a failed sunrise. I've worked in war zones and disease outbreaks and natural disasters and slums all over the world and found people living in conditions that are truly awful by any measure. For hundreds of millions of people, every day dawns not as just a struggle for survival, but with evidence that there is no apparent way for that struggle to improve. For circumstances to change, there is no hope. Despite those reasons for despair, I've continued to find evidence of joy and satisfaction and fulfillment in people living in some of the worst of circumstances. People everywhere rise to an occasion to help others willingly, joyfully, and sometimes with exceptional personal sacrifice. I was deeply pleased to find that very human response expressed so vividly in the wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. So this is where I want to go today. I think we can agree that achievements in science and engineering and medicine have been improving lives and informing personal ethics and enhancing the social contract that we want to feel for each other for several hundred years. Taken together, they've each guided human behavior toward increasing empathy and compassion, though admittedly with fits and starts. And most of us would still agree that many attitudes and actions considered ordinary in 1650 are unthinkable now. That trend is continuing. The educating of girls, the provisioning of clean water, and the advent of Social Security pensions each point to a many-faceted social calming, and each provides benefits beyond first-order effects. The mass of men may still lead lives of quiet desperation, but that mass has become somewhat smaller and a bit less desperate, and we tend to lose track of that achievement in the daily noise. Humanity is, in the main, working to improve itself, giving us, in some ways, the most encouraging prospects for peace we've had in centuries. Two quick examples. I spent 25 years in uniform as a Navy officer. During that time, I had 3 tours in Bosnia, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and spent 10 months in Iraq. During my deployment to Iraq, and for only about 3 weeks, and for all of the wrong reasons, I was something like the Minister of Health. During those weeks, I had a rare chance to see a society in turmoil from the top down and the bottom up. And I bear some responsibility for our failure to quickly reestablish competent medical care. We are all living with the results of those months, and I don't really want to refight that war. But my point is that my perspective was uncommon, and I'm still haunted by the cost of our shortfalls in thinking. How reactive we were, how little we anticipated the systemic impact of our actions, how little we understood the world that we were entering so violently. Not many people get to watch the disintegration of a society, but between January and July of 2003, I was one. My opinions on our management of the Iraq War became a tiny slice of the aftermath, and my essays were coupled with insightful evaluations from others with far deeper experience and greater political insight, and there were results. We discerned new needs and leverage points for better military behavior in a complex emergency, and created new rules that allowed better cooperation with our UN and international civilian cousins doing humanitarian support. Later, in 2005, while still in uniform, I became a part of an effort to have the U.S. military broaden its mandate a little to accommodate humanitarian support as a specific skill. Then and now, a somewhat controversial position. A Department of Defense Directive number 3000.05 released on 28 November 2005 stated, in section 4.1, that the U.S. military had to become just as effective at humanitarian operations as they were at combat operations. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the E-ring it had penetrated that if you want to build a peaceful world, fire and steel, delivered on target, was actually not as effective as stopping diarrhea in the local children. There was no funding or staffing or specifically responsible office for that directive, and it was only a directive, not really policy, and certainly not law. So it wasn't very effective, but that's not the point. Look instead at what that directive really meant. That the United States, the most powerful human agency the world has ever known, was choosing to look away just for a bit from its expertise at turning humans into cindered ash, and instead help others deliver better lives to oppressed people at risk of marginalization and radicalization. Things like renewable power, insulated shelter, clean water, and perhaps education for girls who, but for the luck of the draw, might well have been murdered at birth because of their gender. That policy document, as is so often the case, was driven by a single, caring and charismatic human in a position to be effective, Dr. Lynn Wells, then the Assistant Secretary of Defense, and incidentally, your newest board member here at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Working with Lynn on the development of that somewhat astonishing document was another almost invisible avatar of where humanity is going, Dr. Dave Warner. Dave is an MD PhD in neuroscience and first traveled to Afghanistan in 2004 as a member of a small team looking at how the coalition might learn to be more effective at encouraging ordinary Afghans to oppose the Taliban. To no one's surprise, Dave soon learned that most fathers in Jalalabad wanted their daughters to be educated. The Taliban did not. But those Afghan fathers knew full well that history was being written in their country and that the arc of the moral universe is long and that it really does seem to bend toward justice, but it also bends toward common sense. Brains, as has been noted, are allocated one each to every human, no matter their gender, and to have half of their population intelligent and ambitious but uneducated was a fairly impressive waste of resources, and perhaps a cultural powder keg. By and large, everywhere in the world, fathers love their daughters and want to see them happy. In Afghanistan and elsewhere, as clan and tribal viewpoints have slowly expanded to encourage and encompass larger worldviews, families have recognized that keeping half of your society ignorant and invisible lacks sense. Dave decided that the best thing he could do in Afghanistan was build schools for girls in the rural provinces, connect those schools to the internet, and study the outcome. The results are nicely documented in an academic paper that showed that everywhere Dave built a school for girls, the Taliban were stopped in their advance. If a village had a girls' school connected to the internet, the arguments of the Taliban were refuted by courageous young women who knew more than the Taliban and informed their households. In village after village, fathers banded together and threw out those who would deny their children a place in the world. I talked to Dave yesterday. He's doing fine. He just returned from his 24th trip to Afghanistan. So Lynn Wells and Dave Warner joined with a larger community both inside and outside of the U.S. government to create Dod Directive 3000.05, a document directing the U.S. military to get good at peace building across the civil-military boundary. An integrated structure was modeled to provide heavy lift logistics, threat intelligence, shelter and security when required, and medical support in an emergency. The U.S. Secretary of Defense then signed and released that directive. That all started with a clear-eyed look at the events of 2003 in Iraq and the impact of Dave Warner's work with interconnected rural schools for girls in Afghanistan. Together, we moved DoD past a narrow focus on destructive punishment of an enemy and into methods by which the U.S. military could help reduce the helplessness and the frustration and the rage buried just under the surface in Afghanistan, and perhaps reduce the eventual number of dead American bodies. Another brief story. There are today Karen and Rohingya refugees escaping from violence and oppression in Myanmar, and many of them are currently stuck in a set of refugee camps in northwest Thailand. Every few weeks for the past several years, brokers from the fishing industry in Thailand have come into these camps and purchased young men, ages about 15 to 30, for about $400 each. They would then sell them to the fishing boat captains, who would then work a few of them to death over a year or so, never letting them touch land, and then throw them overboard when they die of exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. The European Union noticed this pattern of slavery and slapped severe sanctions on the Thai fishing industry last year, bringing the issue to the attention of the Thai government and the New York Times. The Thai government rapidly made it clear it wanted the slavery stopped and the sanctions lifted. It turned out the solution might be as simple as visibility, bringing the abused out of the shadows. Last August, an NGO called iRespond introduced verifiable identities through iris scanning and blockchain entries, and they've now scanned more than 13,000 crew members going aboard Thai fishing boats. The crew are scanned as they first go aboard and then again after the fishing boats return. If there is someone missing, there is an investigation and a protocol that can result in the impounding of the catch, the impounding of the boat, and the imprisoning of the captain and crew. In just 2 months, the camps are already seeing a reduction in the purchasing of humans, and it's beginning to look like a win. So how do we take these two anecdotes, one about educating women leading to a humanitarian military directive, and the other about biometric identity reducing modern slavery, and say something more general at a larger scale? It's not difficult. It's a part of the story we're beginning to identify all over the world. Most of us in the room are familiar with Steven Pinker and Better Angels of Our Nature. His massive treatise is mildly controversial, but pretty compelling, and I find his research impressive and his overall conclusion heartening. Better Angels seems to have become a bit of a touchstone, important to the peacebuilding community, and I've not had much trouble accepting his argument that violence has declined over the centuries as we refine the social contract. Paul Hawken sees that too. Hawken is one of the founders of the garden store chain called Smith & Hawken, and he's fascinated by the grassroots efforts toward peacebuilding and responsible stewardship that he's seen all over the world. A decade ago, he wrote a book about those efforts called Blessed Unrest. In it, he describes a few of the thousands of organizations, large and small, putting their time and treasure into improving the world around them. Similar to Blessed Unrest is the more recent World-Changing 2.0 by Alex Steffen, where there are hundreds of detailed stories about people taking initiative to help one another when the governments and corporations surrounding them have not. That capacity to band together and to help move a society forward is one hallmark of civilization. However, the need for organized assistance implies an inability to cope. And there we find a root of the problem: fragility, vulnerability, insecurity. And each of those, in humans as in animals, results in fear and anger, and when limits are reached and opportunity arises, violence. We have each recognized that fragility and vulnerability and insecurity are impediments to peacebuilding and are often the result of poverty. When that poverty is demonstrated to be disproportionately allocated to your tribe, or your clan, or your religion, or your color, the anger simmers, and peace is not only unlikely, but perhaps dishonorable. No one should be expected to accept injustice, and exploitation is unjust. Bigotry is unjust. Bias is unjust. And each should be opposed when they're discovered. Poverty itself is manifestly unjust. Yet Jesus in Mark 14:7 says that the poor shall be always with us. But if poverty and its associated frustration and despair is a root cause of violence, that would make the odds of achieving global peace rather bleak. That same thought is found in Deuteronomy 15:11. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Are we then condemned to both suffer and commit injustice everywhere? I am not in the least a religious person, but I was educated by Jesuits, and I've lived and learned within many cultures where religion is of paramount importance in daily life and political governance. I'm not here to give my opinions on religion, but I will tell you that I strenuously disagree with those Old Testament and New Testament statements. Poverty and ignorance and suffering and abuse are not inevitable and can be eradicated, and the fact that we have not done so is a matter of personal, social, political, and economic will, and all of you know that. And in my view, those who claim to be dedicated followers of Jesus, or Muhammad, or Abraham, or Vishnu, or Buddha, or Marx, or Mao, and don't work to eradicate poverty, ignorance, suffering, and abuse every day, are indulging in a rather breathtaking hypocrisy. Muhammad Yunus, in his Nobel speech and in his book, Creating an End to Poverty, makes it clear that the poor need not always be with us, that we are making choices every day that sentence some fraction of humanity to lives that are nasty, brutish, and short. In many cases, we're making those choices in ignorance or indifference, but we're making them just the same. And for those at the bottom, the reasons we choose what we choose are unimportant. The results are just as bad. John Boyd Orr is quoted as saying, "There can be no peace in the world so long as a large proportion of the population lack the necessities of life and believe that a change of the political and economic system will make them available. World peace must be based on world plenty," unquote. I agree, and there are a lot of people working on that. To your credit, on the Alliance for Peacebuilding's Peacebuilding 3.0 webpage, you're very clear that you also know that. You know full well how complex the problem is, but how well understood the root causes seem to be. You understand clearly the sectors and methods you consider important to the idea of peace building. You have a particular focus on conflict reduction, naturally. But you make it clear that you know that the roots of conflict often lie in drought or disease or earthquakes or economic inequality or unfair resource allocation or betrayal of promises by an unethical politician or subtle changes in a law that gradually becomes more and more burdensome to those already under crushing pressures through an accident of birth. That luck of the draw I mentioned, the accident of birth, came up a lot in the conversations I had about coming here today. Those poor were not born one of us, so instead they're an 11-year-old girl being sold into a brothel in Cambodia so her family can eat. Or they're one of 11 men trying to sleep on the floor of a sweltering concrete room in the garment districts of Bangladesh or the electronics districts of Shenzhen. Or they're having their fingers broken as a deeply resented second wife when the meal is not ready on time. Or they're in agony with an untreated cancer in a village near Ramallah, or in rural Mississippi, or in a slum outside of Dar es Salaam. We are not going to achieve peace while these conditions persist. And it's no surprise that in an age when global communications make gross inequality visible to even the most remote rural village, that we find those villages now contain a lot of rage. In your writings, the Alliance describes peace building as an integrated field, encompassing health, education, democracy, gender equality, the rule of law, and more. But you also describe the goal that you seek, that we seek, that peace building is an integrative catalyst, a loom that weaves together socially desirable threads into a single cohesive whole. You also recognize that the process is dynamic and that every effort we make in any single sector does ripple through every other. I've had a chance to think about it, and I see now that there is a single fulcrum around which I think peace building might eventually turn. And that's energy. If you want peace, provide energy. But make it the right energy. Fossil fuels have to be eliminated, and renewables have to be distributed. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment, but we should be careful about a completely predictable consequence of provisioning energy. The World Bank and the International Energy Agency just published their statistics on global access to electricity. In 1990, only 45% of India's population had access to electricity. Today, it's nearly 80%. In Afghanistan, only 0.2% had access to electricity in 2000, about one Afghan in 500. By 2014, it was almost 90%. Those are remarkable and hard-won achievements, and they unquestionably make life better for millions of people. In the development and humanitarian space, we talk about energy poverty as a uniquely valuable problem to address. And I agree it is, and I'm deeply pleased we've been so successful at bringing light and air conditioning to so many people. But with that provisioning of energy comes communications the way days follow night. And with communications, just like those girls in Dave's schools, comes knowledge. And some of the knowledge they gain should be really uncomfortable for us, and perhaps infuriating for them. Our pettiness, our superficiality, our self-centeredness and self-importance, our heedless waste, our greed, and our indifference all will find recognition in their eyes. Those girls see it, and what should they think? What should they do? Let's continue beyond energy for the moment to another benefit that energy provides, and that's jobs. Paul Pollock, in his wonderful book, The Business Solution to Poverty, argues that if you want to reduce radicalization, then right after energy provisioning, there should be a focus on job creation. Yes, it's true that conflict is sometimes directly the result of cultural intolerance or ethnic competition or religious absolutism. But there was a telling interview in the New York Times last Sunday, October 9th, written by Camilla Schick and her colleagues, that argues the problem really is sometimes a bit more simple. In their article, they describe that during the surrender of more than 1,000 ISIS fighters from Hawija in Iraq last month, a number were interviewed by Kurds who allowed a New York Times reporter to be present. The journalists write about how one particularly fierce-looking fighter, filthy and disheveled and described as, quote, smelling so bad the interviewers were startled, unquote, was readily forthcoming about the reason he joined ISIS. He said, quote, my elder brother joined, and the $100 a month they pay in salary was better than anything else around, unquote. So, while there might be an unmentioned Islamic idealism or religious fervor in that young man, it seems that once again we could have provided him with meaningful work that paid around $100 a month and maybe saved a few lives. There has been some good research done around such returns on development investment, and one of my favorites is the pure and unvarnished economic arguments for social justice calculated by the Copenhagen Consensus. Controversial group. You might know of them, and some of you might be members. On the list of economic evaluations they've made over the years was a gathering of Nobel winners to look at the return on an invested dollar in various challenges within global development. Out of the hundreds of possible development actions they evaluated, they selected only 19 as the highest possible return on investment, and they gave some concrete numbers. I'm going to share them with you because it only takes 30 seconds and you all need to hear them at least once. The Nobel Summary for Global Development listed these 19 actions and gave ROIs. These are efforts directly related to peacebuilding, but you'll note that sometimes they're listed as breakpoints rather than completed actions. Those represent the best investment level, not necessarily the best thing to do. It is a balanced calculation, and that's controversial, but let's put that particular rabbit hole aside for a moment. For people, there are three categories. For people, They calculate in this order that the best use of money would be to lower chronic child malnutrition by 40%, drop malaria infections by half, reduce tuberculosis deaths by 90%, avoid 1.1 million HIV deaths through providing circumcision, cut early death from chronic disease by 1/3, reduce newborn mortality by 70%, increase immunizations, thereby reducing child deaths by 25%, make family planning available to everyone, and eliminate violence against women and girls. Second category, for the planet, phase out fossil fuel subsidies, drop coral reef loss by 50%, tax pollution damage from energy, and cut indoor pollution by 20%. Last category, for prosperity, reduce trade restrictions, except full Doha, gender equality in ownership, business, and politics, boost agricultural yield consumption by 40%. That means reduce post-harvest losses. Increase girls' education by 2 years, universal primary education in sub-Saharan Africa, and triple preschool in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's look at just a few of the estimated ROIs. For every dollar invested, full Doha trade implementation would yield more than $2,000 for every dollar invested back into the global economy, and most of it in the developing world. Universal contraception, family planning, would yield $120 for every dollar spent. Reducing child malnutrition would yield $45 for every dollar spent. Those are phenomenal numbers. 45x returns. Dream returns even for my venture capital friends. And I think we could agree that each of those 19 is an integral part of any pathway to a lasting peace. A child dying of diarrhea in front of a mother does not promote peace. A pregnancy at 14 and 6 children by 25 does not produce peace. But there are only so many dollars to go around, and sometimes a cold, calculating look at the best use of those dollars can be useful, because those dollars usually are not ours, and those who donate them want to know they're being put to the best possible use. Fortunately, there are already good methods for achieving each of those 19 Copenhagen goals, and many more equally desirable goals, and here are some techniques that have seen success. A decade ago, I was part of a television industry initiative to build climate change into the backstory of movies and television shows. 3 decades ago, telenovelas in Latin America were used to encourage a reduction in birth rates to a level that could be supported by a poor family. Both of those initiatives have had measurable effects. Everyone can watch television, and we need more of that media modeling in peacebuilding. I've also argued for decades that every nation needs their own version of our national public radio, NPR. NPR manages to report intelligently on the issues of the day, but they also make a deliberate practice of encouragement, of tolerance, of seeing both sides, of offering some reasons for optimism, of showing the individuals behind the stories. NPR also encourages a little critical thinking and intellectual curiosity through games and puzzles that don't depend on chance, but on global awareness, a bit of education, and some nimble thought. Like TV, everyone can listen to the radio. Libraries, too, are an underappreciated resource, and many of us don't realize just how important public libraries still are within the United States and how rare they are in the rest of the world. We rightly put a great deal of emphasis on schools, but I think not nearly enough on general access libraries. Not many people can attend school. Anyone and everyone can walk into a library. Those three are related to mass media. I'm going to spend only 30 seconds on social media, though I fully recognize its importance, because its role in peacebuilding is, to put it charitably, mixed. My concerns about social media and peacebuilding are growing. Now, in the early decades of the 21st century, we know more than we used to about inflection and cascades and echoes and the interrelatedness of systems. We're also much, much better at understanding the manipulation of human neurotransmitters. We can, through skillful marketing techniques, make you feel angry or indignant, sad, happy, fulfilled, ostracized, insulted, or demeaned in fractions of a second. And all of that capability has turned social media into a weaponized propaganda machine that is profoundly affecting daily life and thought across the globe. Let me be clear. I consider social media to be amongst the most destructive weapons against Western liberal democracy ever created. Ignoring the obvious use for recruitment, it is now being manipulated malignantly to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt across every continent except Antarctica. And we have very few tools for either analysis or protection. I'm recommending you look at it carefully next year for your Future of Peace lecture, because you have no chance of achieving global peace when you have such overwhelmingly competent opposition to the very idea of peace. I'll leave that topic for now, but don't lose track. I mentioned Lynn Wells a few minutes ago, the man who helped shape Directive 3000.05 and now one of your board members. These days, Lynn is leading a remarkable initiative in collaborative community resilience at nearby George Mason University. Borrowing methods described in an outstanding book called Peers, Inc. by Robin Chase, he's using tools from the sharing economy coupled to integrated systems of water, power, shelter, lighting, healthcare, education, and job creation, and creating platforms for reducing poverty, marginalization, radicalization, and outmigration. He's working to build effective communities in difficult places. His projects combine knowledge sharing, community focus, innovative economics, integrated platforms, learning, and teaching. He takes that mix into cross-cutting approaches that reinforce public-private, whole-of-society, and transnational frameworks. Since underserved communities in the developed world have similar needs, his projects fit Appalachia, rural New Mexico, Japan, Moldova, and sub-Saharan Africa. A community resilience lab for this effort has been set up at George Mason, and they'd be glad to work with anyone who's interested. Another member of your board is Clare Lockhart. Clare runs the Institute for State Effectiveness here in DC and is an expert at assessing failed states. She's spent years shifting aid efforts from projects to systems, engaging stakeholders at every level, and sometimes with Lynn Wells, building platforms for block grants that provide respect, resources, and hope to poor villagers in more than a dozen countries. Villagers are determining what they need with mandated inclusiveness and participation in the discussion. The results, evident most obviously, in the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan have been remarkable, and the model has been spread. Remaining at that nation-building perspective for a moment, Elon Musk has proposed that the entire broken and bankrupt fossil fuel system for energy production in Puerto Rico be scrapped, replaced with rooftop solar panels and batteries and other distributed renewable energy designs. That would leapfrog old and outmoded energy ideas and develop some cost-effective resilience for an island currently evaluating its very existence. That possibility, that prospect, will be evaluated over the next few weeks and may prove a bellwether opportunity that can provide 1,000 useful lessons for elsewhere in the world. Remember those principles of positive reinforcement. The technologies for distributed renewable energy are an anchor capability for disease reduction, for education provisioning, for contraception, for water purification, carbon sequestration, gender equity, calorie generation, a reduction in post-harvest losses, and yes, peace building. With renewable energy provisioning, we might also begin building regenerative human settlements. Those design criteria are well tested and becoming scalable and can provide yet another technique for social calming, job creation, and a reduction in resource pressures. We also have good evidence that the new science of restoration agriculture, an accessible combination of NASA space technologies, thank you, Administrator, and indigenous wisdom, can rapidly reduce malnutrition and increase self-sufficiency while regenerating broken ecologies in a single generation. That consequent improvement in diet, incidentally, helps improve thinking. Malnourished brains are compromised brains, and micronutrient deficiencies contribute to a lack of impulse control. Let's keep going. As of today, at least 5 global car makers have determined that they are going to phase out their gasoline and diesel engines and convert to an array of electric vehicles. And they think they're going to make handsome profits in that very desirable transition. Tesla has now created solar panels that serve as roofing shingles for homes. Those shingles produce more power than the home requires and now cost less than conventional roofing materials. With a Tesla Powerwall battery, already cheaper than the original battery offered last year, almost any home anywhere in the world can be completely self-sufficient in energy. So last, let's go larger. This time in the words of Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory is a close friend with 8 honorary doctorates and has been named a hero of the planet by Time magazine. He says this, quote, "Imagine a world secure, free from privation or attack, where conflict prevention is as normal as fire prevention, where conflicts not avoided are peacefully resolved through strengthened international laws, norms, and institutions, where threatened aggression is reliably deterred or defeated by non-provocative defense that makes others feel and be more secure, not less, where all people can be nourished, healthy, and educated, and where all know Dr. King's truth that, quote, peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of justice, unquote. Imagine a world where reason, diversity, tolerance, and democracy are once more ascendant, where economic and religious fundamentalism is obsolete, where tyranny is odious, rare, failing, and dwindling, and where global consciousness has transcended fear to live and strive in hope, unquote. Peter Diamandis, in his book called Abundance, lays out a picture of global peace driven by capabilities like these undreamed of when the United Nations was formed in 1948. Those capabilities in energy, water, food production, shelter, education, transportation, and communications can contribute to peace building when anticipated and integrated, but can serve to further divide us if we ignore their onrushing presence and merely react. So, there is something to fear in our new abilities, but there is also reason for great hope. So therefore, with the world delicately balanced between fear and hope, with the outcome in suspense, and a whiff of imminent shift in the air through the efforts of Lynn and Claire and Dave and Elon and Amory and thousands of others, let us choose to add the small stubborn ounces of our own weight on the side of applied hope. As Zen master Goto Roshi put it, infinite gratitude toward all things past, infinite service to all things present, and infinite responsibility to all things future. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Will you join us in the middle?
Good morning, everyone.
Well, Eric, I think you just saved us about $250,000 apiece because that was an entire university education. That was just great. Thank you so much. It's hard to know where to begin, but I'm going to begin with Melanie. And I'm wondering whether you would have a comment or a question before we open it up.
Well, I'm feeling truly grateful and overwhelmed by the breadth and the hope you presented to all of us today.
Yeah, that worked.
Thank
Good.
you, Eric. It
Good.
most definitively worked. And I heard so much of our language and our dreams in your talk. And I wanted to just ask a couple of questions that echo so beautifully the themes that we've talked about over the last few days. So you were really clairvoyant in that. The first is you spoke earlier in your speech about how humanitarian intervention doesn't always take into account the systemic issues in which you're engaging, and that there isn't always as good of an assessment as you would want. Do you have ideas about how our community, which specializes in conflict assessment and systems change, could work more effectively in that setting?
I'm going to make a tiny correction there.
Good.
That bit about not understanding the systemic implications had to do with the military intervention in Iraq. And even though I was working on the humanitarian side at the time, it was distinctly the perspective that we had brought in as a coalition set of forces. That said, I've looked at your agenda for the past couple of days. I apologize that I couldn't attend. It looked like it was fascinating. But there is now a much richer science, a much richer mathematics than we've had in the last 30 years around the complexity of systems, the interrelatedness of systems. Brian Arthur has done some wonderful work on this at the Santa Fe Institute, looking particularly at the impact of economics on development. He teaches at Singularity University from time to time, at Berkeley, at Stanford, and he and I share a position in Beijing. I will tell you that there is a lot of system science being developed for the humanitarian space. Much of it may actually be coming from within this room. So we are making interventions with a bit more understanding of the likely ripples, but it is still very difficult for practitioners on the ground like me to understand what little bit that we're doing and the effect that's likely to have over time. Which is why we are trying to be a little bit more polite. I'm going to be in Puerto Rico tomorrow. I'm being met on the airfield by FEMA and by the governor's office. And I'm going to ask, what's going on? What do they see as the issues? And I'm going to try to listen. And I've got several people that are going to be standing with me with different areas of expertise that will try to tease out things that we think will be useful. It used to be we would get off the plane, we would get into the vehicles, we would load up the gear, we would go wherever we had decided we wanted to go. We're a bit more polite about that now, both for the locals in the governor's office and below, and the interventionalists, those that have come in from the outside, in this case FEMA. It's really a very difficult. Let me be delicate about this. I haven't been delicate about anything else, but let me try to be delicate about this. Puerto Rico seems to be a colony. And for those of us that are coming in from the outside, but who are U.S. citizens, the complexities of this response are way beyond the norm. We don't have an OSOC. We don't have an on-site operations and coordination center from UN OCHA. So we don't have this overarching tent where we all meet for the humanitarian update brief at 5 p.m. We also don't have the normal FEMA urban search and rescue teams that we would see in Harvey or in Irma or in New York after Superstorm Sandy. It's this weird hybrid, and it's very far away, and it's quite awkward. This is not the time to be pulling back from this exceptionally difficult response. That was a longish answer, I'm sorry.
And may I ask one more question as a reflection, which was first taking into full account your warning about social media, and we've had a stream over the course of the last 3 days on how to start understanding the destructive system and to really be able to build antidotes into that system. But I wanted to ask you, you had a phrase that you would like to see conflict prevention as common as fire prevention.
Yep.
And I was just thinking as you were talking about linking up the girls' rural schools to the internet, what do you think are the levers by which we can start to bring that conflict prevention into the idea that it's an everyday skill? We all need to be able to talk to people who are different and avoid conflict, or avoid violent conflict.
I never like to sound like a broken record, but can we please educate women? Every time we do that, we find that there are, and I've used that term now 3 times, social calming that takes place. Because, not to be unduly stereotypical, by and large, women would like things to live. Women seem to create conditions conducive to life. That is a phrase from Janine Benyus, slightly paraphrased, the author of Biomimicry, who says life creates conditions conducive to life. Women create conditions conducive to life. And the capacity for collaboration seems to become a little richer when women are in positions of power. These are gross oversimplifications, and I'm going to get endless noise about this later, but that seems to be my best thought on this. It's not very complicated.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, there's a gender dimension that I have found particularly in the field of reducing conflicts within and between religions, that I don't know of any such conflict that was started by a woman, but many of them are, most of those trying to work to solve them are women, actually. I wanted to just ask you a little bit about, you mentioned Lomberg's work in the Copenhagen Consensus, and it reminded me that Jesse Helms, not exactly a member of this fraternity in the past.
I was not expecting that name. Okay.
Once proposed that there be an integrated, completely integrated foreign affairs budget, that you would rank in priorities every part of the foreign affairs community. So you'd say, well, we need so many F-16s, and then we need the Peace Corps program in Latin America, and then we need the India railroad program, or whatever, and we would compete head to head, in essence, these programs, because he felt that all the things that we believe in would fall to the bottom, and the hard security stuff would, so that would be easy. But Lomberg gives us the possibility of asking whether we could compete in his rounds, and whether we're pulling enough information or heading towards pulling enough information to have peace building compete against other major sources of human improvement. What do you think?
I think that by and large, you're trying to stay away from blanket statements, but by and large, data is your friend. The more information we can collect, the more patterns we're likely, I'm supposing here, we're likely to recognize that interventions in the humanitarian sphere are by and large more effective than interventions that are not in the humanitarian sphere. So when you try to increase social well-being, you find that your return on investment is much higher than it might otherwise be if you were looking for some other goal. I'm not completely sure that's always true, just like I am now completely sure that bad guys sometimes win, and bad ideas sometimes win, and the right thing to do is often not done. But if you have enough information, I think we now have tools that are good enough to tease out a recognition that investing in social well-being is the best use of investment dollars.
Write that down. Let's take it to the bank. All right. Do we have some microphones here? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Let me give you all a bit of a warning. I got bombed a couple of times. I am completely deaf in my right ear, and I'm kind of scrambled over in my left. So don't hesitate to yell your question, or I will just walk down to you and we can have a face-to-face discussion. Okay?
Okay. Hands in the corner right there. Ambassador.
Thank you, Dane Smith.
And Bob, I'm going to ask you to help if I can't hear, okay?
I was very much impressed by your summons to action and dazzled by the many examples that you gave. But I did have one problem that I would like to point out. You seem to impute to two verses in the Bible, one in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament, the view that the Bible says that poverty is with us permanently. And given the vast amount of attention the Old Testament gives to poverty, and the New Testament with Jesus' relationship to the poor, I thought that was a real disservice. So perhaps you could comment. I found rather puzzling your subsequent remark about Jesus and Muhammad, etc. If you could clarify that point. I think it's quite relevant to peace building and development.
So, complex question. And let me go ahead and alienate the room. I don't like religion of any kind. I have found it a profoundly destructive influence, and I wish I could eliminate it from the planet. So I'm not in a position to make any arguments to or for any statements in any religious book. And it's a perspective that I just won't take any further. Is that fair? I'm an atheist, have always been, intend to be. I don't like religion, end of subject.
Wow.
Back to you, Bob? No, somebody else.
Let's see, I saw a hand back there, and then we'll go over there. That gentleman with his fist up. Okay. I'm sure that doesn't That's not the lead into the question.
You'll see from my size, I'm not an NFL
I'm sorry,
player.
sir.
My name is Aaron Chassie. I'm with Catholic Relief Services. Not to worry.
Touche.
Not to worry. I also want to share with Ambassador Smith, a real appreciation, the breadth and depth that you covered, and also wanted to maybe raise an issue or a concern that I had from something I heard earlier on in your discourse, particularly about the military taking on a role in humanitarian response, and I think by extension, development and peace building. And for us at Catholic Relief Services, the closer interaction between the international humanitarian relief and development organizations and military actors raises several concerns related to the safety and security of our staff, our partners and beneficiaries, as well as our ability to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. When humanitarian action is used as a tool to further military and political objectives as opposed to a tool for alleviating human suffering or addressing poverty, we're looking at short-term, quick impact projects implemented by the military, which are largely unsuitable and unsustainable because they only address the symptoms and not the root causes and conditions of poverty and violent conflict, nor do they allow for active community participation. And also assistance provided by the military can undermine sustainable development and ultimately the mission of preventing conflict and promoting stability. Finally, blurred boundaries between civilian and military actors in our field have undermined humanitarian principles of independence and impartiality, heightening insecurity for staff partners and beneficiaries. I guess my question in all of that is, can you see a way where the military can stay in its lane and still be a willing and active partner with our efforts to prevent violent conflict? Thank you.
That is a wonderful question. And yes, this is absolutely, so I mentioned that that was an area of controversy then and now. And that's absolutely true. And what we tried to define at the time, I'm going back a decade now, what we tried to define at the time was those areas that would be acceptable. Now, by the way, remember, I've been out of uniform for a decade on the civilian humanitarian side, looking at exactly those risks and those confusions. Those have been complicated still further by the fact that on at least 2 occasions, militaries of the coalition have chosen to paint their helicopters white in order to reduce their chances of being fired upon while they were going in on non-humanitarian missions. This is unconscionable, a violation of international humanitarian law, no question. However, what we tried to do in figuring out how you take advantage of the enormous logistical capability of coalition forces, whether U.S. military or the rest, and give to the humanitarian actors the resources that might be beneficial without compromising them. And we found those 4 things that I listed, and they were known as LISH, right? Logistics, heavy lift, intel about where there were things they ought to be worried about, security when it was needed, so warnings and shelter when it was required, and emergency medical care, health. Those 4 things at that time seemed to be an acceptable 4 things and not any further. That's now become, I think, a little bit more complicated with what really is effectively the evisceration of the U.S. State Department. There are now roles that probably need to be picked up somewhere else in the U.S. government. And by the way, I do not speak for the Department of the Navy, the Department of Defense, the U.S. government, and they would be the first ones to tell you that. There are now gaps, right? Out of this administration, there are gaps. I met morning before last with the executive director of the Global Development Laboratory at USAID. And without getting into great detail, they're looking at a 50% cut right now and an 85% cut coming up. Think about that. These are the ways that we help establish humanitarian support as an agent of U.S. foreign policy. So, if not them, then who? That's where the challenge comes in. I promise that as a former Navy officer, we are exquisitely sensitive to the fact that we don't belong doing some classes of things, and when we do those classes of things, we pose a risk to you. We know that. We all know that. Line, staff, everybody, top to bottom, knows that. But how does it get done if you don't have the resources, and we do, and we're willing, and you're kind of sort of willing? We need agreements. And that's what conversation is all about. There was this set of demonstration called Strong Angel back in the 2000s, where we brought a very wide range of actors into the field to reproduce the problems that were found in places where we had found each other. So Rwanda, Kosovo was the first one. Iraq, Afghanistan was the second one. And the tsunami in Banda Aceh, tsunami Katrina, were the last. And in each we tried to identify where there had been scratch points, where there had been sandpaper, where there had been threats that appeared, where there was misbehavior, people going too far one side or the other. And we worked out some details. Out of those kinds of discussions came the Oslo Accords, right? The military, the places where military support can be used in humanitarian operations from a UN perspective. So it's problematic, right? It's complicated. But it's also worth negotiation because I'll speak military, we have things you need, you have things we want to have happen. We will facilitate if we possibly can, and you tell us when we've reached a limit. Is that fair?
Thank you. Very interesting answer. If I were a political scientist, I would footnote that the difficulty with the lab at USAID was that it was started by the Democrats and that Puerto Rico leans too far to the left. But I'm not a political scientist, so I won't say a word. There was a question back there at the end.
Yes, and as you're developing your question, people who are standing, feel free to come to the front. We have room up here.
I'm Theo Sitter. I'm with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. We're a faith-based Quaker lobby in the public interest.
I knew I was going to annoy a lot of people. Yeah, sorry.
But we can still have a conversation, right? So, thank you. This has been a fascinating lecture. And particularly, for me, I get fascinated when I start hearing about designing, creating systems, and particularly systemic change.
Louder, please. To
affect people, sorry. What I thought I heard a lot of throughout your presentation was, it's creating systems and solutions to meet people's needs and to improve livelihoods. What I didn't hear, and it came out a little bit when you talked about Puerto Rico towards the end, is at what level are the local communities themselves and local civil society actors involved in not only in the implementation process, but in the design process, right? And as as the new technology comes in, you mentioned Elon Musk as providing technological, innovative solutions to a complex crisis in Puerto Rico as a result of a natural disaster. At what level of that design process, in your mind, do the local communities themselves have a role in actually designing and creating those solutions? Because and perhaps you partner with other organizations that do that, but that's not something that I heard. And of course, when local communities, as peace builders, we know when local communities are not involved, even the best solutions tend to fall apart. And we have example after example of that, from Haiti to Afghanistan to Iraq, right?
Thank you, Phil. Great.
So, When I mentioned Iraq, I mentioned how ill-prepared we were to understand the implications and the consequences of our actions. Since then, over the past 15 years or so, there has been a significantly enhanced effort to understand the communities that we're going into at a much deeper level than we ever considered doing before then. The National Solidarity Program that I mentioned, that Clare Lockhart of this organization began in Afghanistan long ago, a decade ago, stopped for a while, is coming back again, is an example, I think, of exactly the kind of concern you raise. That for a very long period of time, particularly in the development world, not developed world, there was a paternalistic approach that looked at a community from the outside and decided what they needed. Naturally, that has fallen by the wayside, very much like the paternalism of my own profession. Medicine has fallen somewhat by the wayside. There are now better ways of doing assessments that involve the people that we're intending to do something on behalf of. Never end a sentence with a preposition. While I was in Haiti during the earthquake in 2010, I had a translator, and she listened to me on a satellite phone call about something, 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 will I make arrangements, something, something, something. And when I hung up, she looked at me and said, "Please do not do things for me without me," which was telling and embarrassing, and she was completely correct. And by the way, it later became a bumper sticker. It can be seen all over Port-au-Prince. The concept of inclusion, radical inclusion, is something that is well recognized, borrowed from Burning Man. Let me just ask a question. You're a special kind of audience. How many in the room have been to Burning Man? Thank you. Yay.
Another doctor.
So I've had 6 times. I've been there 6 times. And I work in Central Camp. There's a hospital that we have in Central Camp, and I'm one of the docs there. And on the list of things that Burning Man is famous for is that idea of radical inclusion, that you go to absolutely everybody for an opinion. So this is, again, a fairly long answer, but that's why you put me up here instead of out there. It is something that we're trying to get better at. We are beginning to develop tools and evidence that doing it that way is better than doing it some other way. Is that an okay answer for now?
Yes, one here and one here. Then I'll come in the front.
And Chip, you need to get out there. Black Rock Desert, the Playa. Too old, yeah, right.
Okay, my name's Nadine Block, and I work with a group called Beautiful Trouble, mostly. That's where you can find me. And I thank you very much for your wide-ranging conversation. Sparked a lot. I just thought I would get up because there weren't any other women asking questions, so that was the first one. I agree with educating women across the board. And then I'm going to ask something that you touched on, the social media piece, because in the world that I work in on-the-ground nonviolent action resistance training, this is a big deal. And if we're looking at what happened here in the elections, it's currently in the news. I guess the question for me is, if we're talking about systemic focus on the problem, the social media is a touch point for looking at corporate control. And the question about what does it look like to have any kind of democratic input or democratic control in that specter, and and really we know we can use this to influence people's behavior. We obviously see that, but do we have the will or the capacity to use it to influence people's behavior for the good, in our
Thank you.
definition of the good.
Thank you.
And just the follow-up is, do we, in our world, our left-leaning world, we don't often want to coerce, to use that word broadly, people into doing anything, whether it's better or worse in our definition. So any comments would be interesting on that.
So, I quite deliberately went a little hyperbolic on you for that paragraph. Social media is indispensable and has been a democratizing factor in ways undreamed of by Zuckerberg and the rest. I was at Google for years. I know the value of social media. It is, however, true that while I'm not altogether convinced that technology is inherently neutral, there's a long philosophical argument that goes several ways. I am aware that those who have technological capabilities gain distinct advantages. So paying attention to a technology will make you better at its implementation, more flexible, more rapid. And many of the people who are angriest on this planet are under age 30. They have the capacity to use tools that we just had Chip say that he's not going to come out to Burning Man because he's too old. That's not good, right? We can't abdicate experience. And it is valuable to recognize that idealism, well, and this is not intended, this is something that I actually absorbed at a very young age. There was a phrase, saying by Winston Churchill, who said, not to be a communist at 18 is proof of want of heart. To be a communist at 30 is proof of want of head. Fun sentence. It is true that there is a generational distinction in how social media is being used. But if so many angry people are under age 30, and so many people who are in subordinate positions doing what they're told are being told to do something on social media that is destructive, there's likely to be a lot of capability there. And I have a bit of a viewpoint here that is not present in this room, in that I am a part of the discovery of what happened in the 2016 election. It's a not very complicated story. And a lot of it will come out over time. A lot of it is out already. And so I am perhaps taking a stronger viewpoint than I might otherwise if I didn't have that knowledge. But we have been had. And it's very important to recognize that. And very important to not tolerate that. So, social media is a mixed bag, as I said. And I really do think you got to get Zuckerberg on your calendar for next year.
Wow. I saw two hands, one in the back here and then one in the front. And let's hear both the questions. They'll be our last questions, just to get them on the record. And if we have time to answer them, that would be great. Short would be great. Yeah.
Harriet Lamb from International Alert. You said that by and large, humanitarian interventions are more effective than non-humanitarian interventions, and indeed your entire speech was a wonderful proof of that. And yet governments around the world behave as if exactly the opposite was the case. And even before the recent cuts you were referring to in the US, the world is spending 250 times more on the military than on peace building. So what do you think we should do to address that and better make our case? And do you think the military would support a greater investment in peace building?
Thank you.
I love that second question. Second part of that.
Can we just hear this one and then
Sorry?
get on the record? Can I just take one more and then you can wrap up at the same time?
Oh.
Oh, you want to go now? Okay.
Yeah.
All
Give me
right.
a second with this one. And
All right,
we'll
sure,
go wherever you
okay.
want.
You're
yeah,
running the
because
show.
frankly, I get on a plane when I leave here, and I'm not eager to leave you guys.
Okay, good.
So I would love to have an answer to that. So, first of all, let's go to the second one first. You asked, would the military support greater humanitarian budget interests shifting? What?
Peace building. Peace building.
Peace
Greater support for peace building.
Rather than humanitarian? The distinction you're drawing there? Okay, peace building, yes. Yes, I think they would. Again, I don't speak for them, but most of us, and I had 18 deployments, okay? Most of us would like to go home. Most of us have kids, we have wives or husbands, we have people we care about, we have a dog, we have a cat. We would like to go home. Our colleagues out there smell bad, hygiene issues, we'd like to go home. The ability to support initiatives that have a peace-building mandate has been shown several times to do more for active duty military morale than anything else we do. By and large, humans would like to help humans. Humans that have an opportunity to go someplace where people are really in trouble and really help because they bring fantastic resources to bear and make a genuine difference in a measurable period of time, that's deeply rewarding. Ask any Marine. Ask any Navy corpsman. Ask the Army guys that went forward with the 101st into West Africa during Ebola. Right? Even though they weren't treating patients, we didn't go anywhere near Ebola patients. It was all infrastructure stuff. People would like to help people. People who have some resources would like to use those resources to help people, even if those people don't look anything like themselves, even if those people were raised to believe that people who didn't look like them weren't really full people. I watch attitudes change in an afternoon. So yes, I think that the military would be willing to entertain more peace-building activities, and the idea that we don't build nations is just garbage. Of course we build nations. Let's build them better.
Eric, I have a wife to go home to as well, and I want to recognize her for the last question.
What do I say to that? Thank you very much. And thank you,
Please
Eric.
speak up.
Thank you, Eric, for a really remarkable sharing of your wisdom and experience. And when you answered Melanie's question and talked about women, I thought that we needed to unpack that a little bit more and appreciate that a little bit more. And so my question is, when you said that, and you cited women as this fulcrum for investment in peace building and sustainable development, how do you integrate that in your work on the ground? You talked about the list, the logistics and security, et cetera. Is there a formula that you have or an intention to make sure that women are integrated? Also, women in the military, and do you see any resistance to including women in some of your work?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me give two sides to that. On the military side, we learned through the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s that we will do better if we have a woman on the team, even if she's in full battle rattle, right? She's wearing Ranger body armor, she's carrying an M16, she's got a helmet, she's got sunglasses. It still goes better if we have a woman on that forward team. So let's put that aside because I can't speak to that. I don't know what they're doing now. As far as the work that I do, I get pushback all the time. Every time my team deploys, we have a woman on the team because we find we are locked out of some aspects of culture if we don't. Today, Denise Hatum is deploying with us to Puerto Rico. She's a native Spanish speaker. She's a registered dietitian. She is a ballet dancer. She's a very interesting human being, originally I think from Argentina. And without her, we would not get as much done as I know we will with her. When we went into Haiti, we went with Leanne Miller. Leanne Miller had 50 trips to India, where she runs a series of schools in the south of India, PhD education out of Stanford. And without Leanne, we wouldn't have the kids demonstrating on the last day to us how well they could now count that they couldn't before. In the course of a week, while we were building water purification and power, Leanne had gone off to have a school with the children. So we do get pushback. We have had occasions, one occasion in particular, where we were told we could not bring our female person in with us on the team, and we decided not to go. That is a similar thing to what happened in Gaza when we were asked to bring water in after the destruction of the water purification plant, and we found we couldn't gain safety. Neither side was able to tell my team that they could guarantee our safety. Not Palestinian, not Israeli. There are too many extremists on both sides. And they said that was in part because we were not willing to give up the fact that we go in with a female engineer. Another person who's coming in with us to Puerto Rico is a woman engineer who's the Associate Director of Advanced Technologies at MIT Lincoln Labs. She's Puerto Rican. She's from Utuado in Puerto Rico. We're staying with her mother. And so the assets that come from something like a gender balance can't always be evenly balanced. We just don't have the skill set yet. But there is always a presence. It is sometimes a pushback, but we are working for ways at better integration. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
I want to thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. I want to thank you for integrating your photographs with it that really helped illuminate.
I didn't look at them. Were the photographs good?
Oh, yes,
Beautiful.
really.
I'll tell Lorenzo.
Yes.
Really
Okay?
great, really great. And I want to thank you for very thoughtful answers to our questions. And I want to also invite all of you to suggest people for the rest of the series, because let's have some more fun on this. Melanie, do we have anything to announce before the...
To just add my very heartfelt thanks, and also in my Master of Ceremonies role, to remind you to please be back at 11:15 for our Innovative Finance Part 2 with the Peace and Security Funders Group, and to please visit our exhibitors. I bought these bracelets from Article 22, made out of exploded ordnance in Laos, but we have wonderful people who want to share ideas with you. So again, thank you, Eric. Thanks to all of you.
And you too. Thank you.